All right, so this is a very exciting one for me. Back in the 90s, I'm growing up, I'm a youngster. Basketball, not a big thing in my hometown of Montreal. I'm a diehard New York Knicks fan, and I need some Knicks coverage. And I don't get it on television. I don't get it on the radio. I don't get it in the local newspaper. I find a local corner store a few blocks from my house that sells the New York Daily News and the New York Post. And this is prime New York Knicks, Patrick Ewing, Charles Oakley, John Starks. And so every day after every game, I would walk over to this corner store and I would buy the Post to read the great Mark Berman, and I would buy the Daily News to read the great Frank Isola. Now here we are some 25 years later, and Frank Isola is on the program. Wow, this is huge for me. Thank you for doing this, Frank.
Well, thanks for the introduction. And then the first time that we met, it was a very kind of New York moment. We met right in the middle of Times Square because you had been on, I believe it was it a Duke?
I Hate Christian Laettner.
Yeah, it was the I Hate Christian Laettner documentary. I actually thought I had no idea who you were. And I was watching it. I thought you were really good. And you were being pretty reasonable. And then I'm in Times Square, leaving the Times Square studio where I was doing, I think they were shooting Around the Horn. I walk out on the street and you're out there with some camera crew. And I was like, oh, look who it is. That's the guy that was on the I Hate Christian Laettner documentary, which I thought the documentary was very good as well. So I walked right up to you. I was like, you
were a fan of mine.
Yes, because I thought you were very good on that. And I liked that. I think in the documentary, you might have had your Expos cap on, right? Or you had something.
We showed Malcolm X. I used to wear Malcolm X gear.
Yeah, that's right. They showed you as a little kid.
That's right.
Yeah. So then that's right. We started talking about Montreal, and I had mentioned how when I covered the Mets a million years ago, went up to Montreal, which was great. And you're talking about newspaper stands. The Sheridan that's downtown, which is pretty close to St. Catherine Street.
Yep.
There was a great newsstand there. And when I was there with a bunch of the Met writers, we would walk to the newsstand to get the New York papers. And the gentleman working there, he knew who we were, which is hard to do because back then there's no Twitter. Right. We're not on TV. But once he knew we were the writers, every time that we went there, he would have the papers rolled up for us, ready to hand all the New York papers. Obviously, we're paying him for the papers, but it was great. It's always good to go to a town. I always say this, the first time I was ever in London, it felt like an old newspaper town because you still have the newsstand there with all the different newspapers and the headlines and the back page and everything. It was really exciting.
Okay, so that leads me to get right into it. You currently work for SiriusXM. You do the great Starting Lineup radio show with the White Mamba, Brian Scalabrine. Excuse me. I listen to it every morning. I love it. You had someone on as a caller a couple of days ago saying you guys are the greatest morning show of all time. I think that's a little bit much.
That was my brother.
Right. But it's a great program. You also do the Nets coverage for Yes, and you work for ESPN as well. You don't write anymore.
I know.
And so I'm wondering, just off the bat, I mean, I learned about you as a writer. I read the great book Ballin, co-written by you and Mike Wise about the 1999 New York Knicks. I followed you to The Athletic, et cetera, et cetera. But for the last couple of years, you have not written consistently anymore, and you got into this business as a writer. How do you feel about that?
I definitely miss it a lot. There is something about column writing, which more so than doing like long form stories and features on guys, I like reacting right off to, right after a game, which is really what we're doing on a morning radio show because the games happened at night and we're kind of giving our take in some ways right away. I miss that part of it. I really do. Now I did write last year in terms of writing a book. I wrote a book with Charles Oakley. So that occupied most of my winter, which was a challenge in itself, but it was also pretty cool going back down that road with him, getting back into some of the things that did happen in the 90s, the early 2000s when he was in the NBA. But the writing part of it, I definitely miss. You get to write, and there's something about being on radio, which is exciting. There's something about being on TV, which is exciting. But writing this, it's different. I almost feel, and I don't mean this, I'm not on anybody on TV or radio, you almost feel that people take you more seriously when you write, especially when I wrote for a newspaper.
Do you foresee a time where you'll ever go back to writing, or do you books, one thing, but like consistently like you were before, not on the beat, but would you like to get a gig where you're able to write columns again?
100%. I definitely would. Because I think there's a lot of fun stuff to weigh in on. There's a lot of trends to weigh in on. The whole thing with these players today complaining, the NBA players complaining about the way the game is being called, but you have a lot of people coming out saying they like it better. Draymond Green has come out. Steve Kerr has come out. Kyle Kuzma's come out. I know on our radio show, myself and Brian Scalabrine, we like the NBA a little bit better this year because it's more physical. That would be a fun thing to write about. Look at what happened with Russell Westbrook last week with this whole, end of the game protocol that you should have when he got mad at Darius Bazley for dunking the ball in the final seconds up 5. And what happened on Friday in Staples Center? Dwight Howard hit a 3, 40 seconds left in a blowout win. And there's Russell Westbrook on the sideline laughing, jumping up and down. So which one is it, Russell?
Right.
How does it work? It's only when you want to celebrate and have a good time. But the Oklahoma City Thunder, to me, there's so many great, the NBA is a great writing sport. Baseball is a great writing sport. The NBA is a great writing sport. I think soccer is that as well. As you know, boxing is probably the premier writing sport, boxing, MMA, because it's about individuals. It's about people and things like that. Football is a little bit tougher because I think football is such a television sport. It's not a great writing sport, but NBA and basketball in general, college basketball, high school basketball are great writing sports.
Do you remember the first time when you had the epiphany that this is what you want to do for a living? You want to be a media guy? When did that start?
Definitely at a young age. So there was a gentleman who lived not too far from me who was a sports editor of the New York Post. His name was Jerry Lisker, and he was a big boxing guy. So, every once in a while I'd be at his house and he would have a room and this was when he worked for Murdoch. So Murdoch first started out at the Star, which it became a gossip Hollywood kind of paper. But at first it was sports and news. And he was one of the sports guys. So I'd go to his house and he would have pictures of himself training with Ali. He had a lot of stuff like that. It just looked like an exciting lifestyle. Plus I love sports and I like to write. And at a young age, we all dream about, I'd love to play, for the Knicks one day. I'd love to play for the Mets one day. But when you get to a certain point in your life, you realize you're probably not going to become a pro. So it's a great way to stay involved in sports is being part of the media, which is what I did.
And no one, your dad was a cop, right? Like you didn't have
New York
people around you who were media guys.
No, not at all. But what everybody had was a love of sports. So at an early age, kind of realizing why wouldn't you want to be around this all the time? Because, when you work at a newspaper and they always call the sports department the candy store,
right?
Because it's not, it's not the most serious thing. I know there are serious issues. It's a fun job. As you know, there are things that people are never going to understand about the job, which are stressful, which are difficult. It's not the easiest job, but for the most part, it's not that important what we do. It's fun. And you're staying around sports. You're staying around young people. And the great thing about sports, everyone always has a story. The people you cover are all different. That's why when analytics got into sports, which is fine, but the games are still played by people. And those are the stories that I like. That's something that always attracted me to wanting to be in the media, cover sports. It's really the people that play the games.
So what was your first gig in media?
Covering high school basketball for the New York Post, Ariel, to be honest with you, it's probably no different in some ways than starting out in the G League as a professional basketball player, because if you cover high school basketball in any big city, New York, Chicago, DC, Philadelphia, wherever the case may be, the worlds are so connected because the high school coaches are connected to the college coaches who are connected to the NBA scouts and NBA general managers. So, you'd go to these games and there would always be college coaches there. And there would always be kind of the street agents that they like to call them. But it was a great way to get in with those guys. I covered Lamar Odom when he was in high school. I still remember meeting Lamar Odom at the Neptune Diner. There was a guy that was a very good source for me. His name was Rob Johnson. And, they used to call him a street agent. And Rob's big thing was, why do they call me a street agent? Just because I'm a black guy? I get along with players. I talk to them. I have relationships with coaches, whatever the case may be. So we met at the Neptune Diner once in Astoria, Queens. And we had lunch. Years later, at the NBA Finals, there's Lamar Odom. He's holding court. When everything breaks up, he says hello to me. And I said, hey, remember that time we had lunch at the Neptune Diner? And I'll never forget it. He just looks up and he says, the Neptune Diner. Man, I got a lot of paper bags with money at the Neptune Diner. It's kind of like that world. I'm telling you, you're covering, I covered Jamal Mashburn. Within a minute, Jamal Mashburn is at Kentucky playing in one of the greatest college basketball games of all time, was when they lost to Christian Laettner and Duke. And then before you know it, he's on the Dallas Mavericks. Mm-hmm. And then before you know it, he's on the Miami Heat playing against the New York Knicks. And I'm covering Knicks Miami Heat, and there's Jamal Mashburn. The worlds are so close. If you're covering in a huge city where they play basketball, it's very closely related.
When you're a high school beat writer, are there some unspoken rules that you cannot, or transactions that you cannot write about, like that you can't be that guy? For example, the paper bag with the money. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
assuming there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. Would you be blackballed from the scene, from the beat, if you spoke about or wrote about certain things?
I'll never forget when Grady High School, which was right across the street from Lincoln High School in Brooklyn, Coney Island. Lincoln High School is where Stephon Marbury went to school. It's where Marv Albert went to school. And it was immortalized in the movie He Got Game. The Ray Allen character is at Lincoln High School. But Grady that season had the best team in the city. And after they won the city championship, I went to the Sports Page pub, I think it was called, on the Lower East Side. And some of the players on the team were there eating. None of them were drinking, but there were college coaches there and college assistant coaches, which at the time technically wasn't legal. There was no way I was going to write about that. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. They're celebrating. They just happen to be, you could say they just happen to be at the bar. But my biggest rule about that back then, as you know, a big thing was about getting the SAT score. So if you didn't qualify, that was, the Prop 48, they called it back then. I never wrote a kid's SAT score. I would always say they're being recruited by, this school, that school, or he's got it narrowed down to these choices, or he wants to go to this school. I would just say, pending, his academic status. I would never, there were people that would write their SAT score. He got a 690 on the SAT. I'm not going to do that to a high school kid. Embarrassed. That was like my own rule. My paper never said you need to put that in. I wouldn't do it. I thought that was unfair to do to young kids.
So do you go from high school sports to the Mets to the Knicks? Is that the path?
Exactly. So what happened was the Post was having financial difficulty. So a lot of guys were jumping ship and going to the New York Daily News. The Daily News started raiding the Post sports department and picking out some of the people. I think two of our baseball guys left to go to the Daily News. So now it's like early, it might've been February 1st, and spring training is February 14th. They called me in and asked me if I would go to spring training to cover the Mets. I forget, I was young at the time. I had no idea what I was doing. And I was like, I didn't even know, how am I going to get down there? I mean, I know I'm going to fly, but I'm saying, who do I call to get a plane reservation? What do I do once I get down to Port St. Lucie? I don't know what I'm doing. So even that was overwhelming for me. And I got down there and I really didn't have any idea what I was doing, but I got better as a writer and a reporter, because baseball, the sport that, that I covered for a lot of years, was basketball, and it's tough, but it's 82 games. Baseball is spring training for 6 weeks, and you're getting up every day and you're in the clubhouse at 8:00 in the morning. Being a sports writer is a nighttime sport. So all of a sudden you switch to getting up early, getting to the clubhouse, because it's New York, it's the tabloid wars. We're all going to war at 8:00 in the morning. So you work like a dog for 6 weeks, and then the season starts. 162 games. Now, you're not covering all 162, but it's a bear. Like, covering baseball is, out of all the newspaper jobs, that's the guys who cover a baseball beat. That's real work, real hard work.
So how old are you approximately at this time?
Back then, could I have been like 24, maybe?
24. And of this 162, how many are you traveling to?
Because it was my first year, I figured, you know what? Let me try to do as many games as I can. And I covered a lot. I mean, put it this way. They were in Port St. Lucie. Then they went to Washington, D.C. to play at old RFK Stadium to play the Yankees. Mm-hmm. My office made me go to that game. So instead of even coming back home, because they were going to open up against the Colorado Rockies at Shea Stadium, I go to Washington. It's pouring rain. The darn game never gets played to begin with. And then I end up going home. I covered so many games. And Ariel, back then, Friday night was a night that a lot of the beat writers would take off and their backups would cover. I would try to get to every Friday night home game, because by then, now I'm starting to know the players. So I figure now's because the backups are just kind of there. They don't want anything bad to happen. They just want the night to go quickly. And that's when you really could work the locker room, because none of your competition was really around. So that year I worked a ton.
So was that part of, like, I think to be successful in this business, you have to be somewhat of a maniac, right? You have to be a workhorse. You have to be supremely competitive. Is this your competitive spirit coming up? You wanted to crush the competition and be there when the others weren't.
Absolutely. What did Woody Allen say? 95% of life is
80% of success.
80% of success
Yep.
is just showing up. That's really what it's about.
Yeah.
You have to be around. When they did the great documentary on Jimmy Breslin, the famous Daily News columnist, and Pete Hamill, who New York Post columnist, and he went to the Daily News as well. And Jimmy Breslin was a columnist. Like, he got out on the street. Like, that's where he was getting his stories. And I think that's the difference today with a lot of people who write blogs. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, but a lot of people just writing it from the comfort of their home. They're watching something on TV, or they're reading stuff that other people write. Like, to be there, that's how you get to know stuff. And that's how you get to develop sources. You know this from being around. You're in that locker room every day. Eventually the players, that's how you gain trust. Mm-hmm. With the Mets, and the Mets had a tough group. Like, Eddie Murray was on that team, and Eddie Murray didn't talk to the media, but there was a player. So Eddie Murray was number 33. Chico Walker was number 34. Now, I'm not necessarily sure they did it because of numbers, but Chico Walker was very good friends with Eddie Murray. Every single day I was in the locker room, there would be at least one moment. Maybe it'd be 10 minutes, maybe 1 minute. I would go to Chico Walker's locker and we would talk. Chico Walker told me way back when, he said, I got a nephew who plays basketball in Chicago, and he's a great player. He's going to go to Kentucky, and he's going to be in the NBA. You know, I covered high school basketball. You know how many people tell me that? He said, my nephew's name is Antoine Walker. He goes, you got to remember that name.
Wow.
So we're always talking about basketball. Eddie Murray is a huge basketball fan. I can tell that he's listening to us, but I'm not going to bother Eddie Murray because I'm not going to give him the satisfaction of turning me down. Plus, I want him to be more interested. One day, Chico Walker comes to me and he says, he said, Eddie says that you're the one guy that he'll talk to.
Wow.
Right. So this is going over months of talking to Chico Walker. So the Mets are in Houston, and I talked to Eddie Murray, and even then he kind of made me work a little bit for it. Right. He was giving me one-word answers, and then eventually opened up. I turn around, and you know how this works. I see like two reporters standing behind me. And it's awkward, but I had to say, like, guys, we're like, and he even said, like, told people to back away. I invested a lot of time to try to get to talk to this guy. Don't think now you're going to piggyback on it. You know, and that's being around. Again, it goes back to like the point we were both trying to make. When you're around, that's how you develop sources. That's how you gain trust. When I covered the Knicks, Patrick Ewing, he didn't say my name for, I think it was like a year and a half. All of a sudden, one day we're in Dallas, and Don Nelson had been fired by the Knicks and got hired to run the Dallas Mavericks, to be their coach. We're in the locker room in Dallas, the visiting team locker room. I hear Frank. And I know it's Patrick Ewing, and I figured he must be talking to somebody. He then hits me on the back. He says, isn't your name Frank? And I'm like, I can't believe Patrick Ewing knows my name. So I turn around, and he says, your boy's coaching the Dallas Mavericks. Because he and Don Nelson butted heads a little bit, and we all covered it. It was just his way of he wanted to joke around a little bit. But that's why you have to. And Patrick Ewing's one of those guys. I had a relationship with him. He'd talk to the media. He'd take a shower, come back to his locker. And if I needed something that I wanted to ask him by myself, he would give me that, 30 seconds to a minute. Wow. I had a great story during the playoffs, when the stories were coming out that the Knicks might have met with Phil Jackson. This is back in 99. And so I went over to Patrick Ewing after everybody had left, and I brought it up to him. And he said, tell Phil Jackson to take his ass back to Chicago. Come on, man. It's a pretty good quote.
Wow.
That's after Patrick Ewing.
Yes. So, this is during the whole in 99, Van Gundy's on the outs. They're chanting his name.
This is the just balling years.
Right.
And that's why that's the thing about Patrick. And you can appreciate this with athletes you cover. People think the first day I meet them, I'm going to shake their hand. I'm going to tell them who I am, and they're going to remember me. You know how many people are going around these guys nonstop? It's fans, people, when they go to a restaurant, they're not going to remember you. You need to be around, and you have to gain their trust somehow. Once you do, then you're okay. And it took me a long time for Patrick Ewing to even acknowledge who I was and to gain his trust. And we were always cool. We're cool to this day. Patrick is great. I love covering him because he didn't talk all the time, which was good. It wasn't like you covered Charles Barkley, where every day you basically have to sit in his lap because he might say something crazy. I kind of like that Patrick had certain days that he spoke. I was good with that.
Okay, so this is a perfect segue into the Knicks. You get the Knicks job in 95, right? They're freshly off the finals. This is the midst of their incredible run, that incredible decade. The Garden is on fire every night. Great players like Patrick Ewing, Charles Oakley, John Starks. When you get that job, does that feel like you have reached the mountaintop? Like, it's one thing to do the Mets, but I would imagine the Knicks at the time being the only basketball team in New York City with those stars, with those wars with the Bulls and whatnot. That to me feels like the primo job in New York City. Did it feel that way
Yeah.
to you?
Yeah. And you know this going back then. So the Rangers won in 94.
Right.
The Giants were very good, but both baseball teams were down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Nets were the Nets, and the Knicks almost won in 94. So then they lose in 95 to Indiana. Pat Riley leaves. The
Finger
season
roll.
starts, the finger roll game. Exactly. I get a call, again, getting a call less. I'm at the Daily News now, and it's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. So the other guy covering the beat, he got taken off the beat abruptly. So they said, we need you to go to Cleveland. You got to cover the Knicks. And I said, well, am I going to be covering them from now on? They're like, yeah, we'll figure it all out. But you got to get to Cleveland. So I fly into Cleveland on a Tuesday night. The game is Wednesday. I walk into the locker room before the game, and I remember introducing myself to a couple of guys. I introduced myself to Monty Williams, and I squeezed his hand, and he had injured his hand, and he said, damn, my finger. So already I'm making quite an impression. And the locker room in Cleveland is kind of small, so it's a little awkward. And they won that night. And then on Saturday, so they were off Thursday, they were practiced Friday, then Saturday they played the Houston Rockets, and Akeem got kicked out of that game. It was he got ejected, but that was a big thing, beating the Houston Rockets. It was a Saturday afternoon game. But when I told I was covering the Knicks, I was like, wow, this is big time, because I know what basketball means to people in New York. It's the Knicks. It's something I've always wanted to do. It was overwhelming, but it was also exciting. It did kind of feel like, in some ways, even though I hadn't done anything yet, it kind of felt like I had arrived.
So allow me to, because I will never like a group of guys, a sports team. Like, that's my team, right? More so than anything. I will never have fonder memories than being a fan of that era. And those guys to me were so, I remember March 11th, 1995. Were you on the beat March 11th, 1995?
Is that the Jordan game?
No, March 11, 1995 is not a significant moment, but it's the first time I ever went to the Garden.
Oh, okay.
And the date is ingrained in my brain.
No. I wasn't on the beat. And I would always fill in as like a backup.
So you started Thanksgiving of 95, right?
Yeah, Thanksgiving of 95.
Okay, that would have been fun, and we're in the same building. But anyway, it was Knicks Supersonics. It was just a really big deal for me. Flew down from Montreal to go see a game. Ewing had a great game, but got injured in the fourth. Alas, could you give me some good memories from those guys? To me, feel so far away. They almost feel like, you know, these mythical creatures. Starks, Oakley,
Yeah.
Ewing. I've never met Ewing. Like, what are some great memories from being on the beat, on the road, in the locker room? I'm putting you on the spot here, but is there anything you can share?
No, there was definitely something when you first walk in the locker room and you look, and there's Patrick Ewing, there's Charles Oakley, there's John Starks, really the core of the team. But there's Anthony Mason, and then of course there's Derek Harper, who really was kind of like the vocal leader and was such a great guy to deal with. There was a toughness about that team. Listen, they played unbelievable games at Madison Square Garden. But for me, being with them on the road, they loved the idea that the fans they embraced the whole idea that even though none of them were from New York, except for Anthony Mason, they loved the idea that people hated New York, hated the Knicks. They thought they were thugs and all this other stuff. That actually brought out the best in them. The more hostile the crowd, the nastier the crowd, they became that nasty. It was really incredible to watch. They weren't shrinking violets. It was the opposite. Like, Greg Anthony had the great quote in Dan Cloris's documentary on Reggie Miller, Winning Time, when he said, we were either going to win the game or we were going to win the fight. We were getting out of there with a win. And that kind of was the mindset of those teams throughout the 90s, and just being around them. One of the stories that still sticks out the most was right around the time. In fact, it's up in Canada where things changed a little bit, because the Knicks had lost this is in March, almost a year to the day after you had made your debut at Madison Square Garden. So the Knicks lose to the Clippers at home. It's a really bad loss. They go up to Toronto. Now everyone is starting to question, is this going to work out with Don Nelson as a coach? He and Patrick Ewing aren't getting along. They play Toronto. They win the game. After the game, Don Nelson, it's a back-to-back. Don Nelson starts criticizing Patrick Ewing. And I'm like, wow, they just won the game. Why would he be criticizing, the star player on the team. So the Knicks announced afterwards, we have practice tomorrow on Thursday in Philadelphia. It's very rare that after a back-to-back playing consecutive nights that the team will practice. So myself and a guy by the name of Thomas Hill, he was living in Brooklyn. I was living in Brooklyn. We were like, I'm going to the practice. So he said, if you want, I can give you a ride. So we drove down together. We were the only two people at practice. We go up to Don Nelson. I said, are you at all worried that the way the team is going right now, that your job can be in danger? And without skipping a beat, he's like, hey, if they want to fire me, go right ahead and fire me. That's fine. If they think so, the Post and the Daily News, I think our back page was something about like fire me or Dunn Nelson. It might have been Dunn Nelson ? As in like Don Nelson, Dunn Nelson.
Mm-hmm.
And the next morning, we get a call. The Knicks have relieved Don Nelson of his duties. So we're in Philadelphia. And now Mike Wise from the New York Times had come down. We sprint over to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. We find out where Jeff Van Gundy's staying. We knock on his door because he's now the coach. He lets us in. And here's like the three of us with, at the time, the youngest coach in the NBA. And we're in like, you could tell that he's kind of in shock, but he's excited, probably like the way I felt when they put me on the Knick beat. And it was pretty intense moment. And I always still bust Jeff's balls about it. That night they played the Sixers, and that Sixer team was crap. And they lost. So they lose Jeff's debut game. The whole idea, the team's not going to rally around Jeff. The next day they had practice back in Westchester. So think about this now. Tuesday game at home, Wednesday game at Toronto, Friday practice and Thursday practice in Philadelphia, Friday game in Philadelphia, Saturday practice back in Westchester because they're playing the Bulls on Sunday. And this is the 72-win Chicago Bulls. They must have gone for 3 hours. The gym opens up. We talked to the players, talked to Jeff, and a bunch of the players were saying it felt like we were the Knicks again. There's a different sense of the team. The next morning, Jeff has a shoot around at Madison Square Garden. This is for a 5 o'clock game. Remember, NBC would always have like those 5 o'clock games, and the Knicks would always play the Bulls on Selection Sunday for the NCAA tournament. It was their way of kind of going up against the Selection Sunday show. I go to shoot around, and Derek Harper is there, and he says to me, he goes, Frank, I don't know if you gamble. He goes, but if I were you, I would put everything you have on us winning this game tonight, because I'm telling you. Now, this is all off the record. He's not saying, he said, I'm telling you, we are going to win this game today. So like, once again, I'm like, yeah, whatever. I love Derek, and I did believe him, but I'm thinking Michael Jordan and the Bulls are going to kill you guys. So back then we're sitting courtside, and Derek Harper in the third quarter, fourth quarter is having a great game. At one point, Phil Jackson calls timeout. The building is erupting. They're playing Go New York, Go New York, Go. Derek Harper walks back out onto the court to get ready for the Bulls to inbound the ball. He bends over, grabs his shorts, and he happens to look right at me because remember, we're sitting courtside, and he winks. He goes, "What's up, Frank?" Because he knew what he had said to me, and I was like, "Man, this is like pretty cool." You almost feel like you're in the middle of it in this like kind of like bizarre way. And of course, they did go on to win that game. And then 2 days later, Jeff is in Dallas killing Phil Jackson because Phil had campaigned for the Knick job, and we're there. And Jeff says, after our interview with him, he goes, "Turn off your recorders." So let me ask you guys a question. What do you think of what Phil Jackson did? So we're like, well, I don't know. And Jeff started murdering him. And then he said, in fact, you guys can write that if you want.
Wow.
We were like, oh, this is going to be good.
What a legend. Could I ask, as a small tangent, I want to stay on the Knicks for a second, but could you do what you guys did? You find out that Don Nelson has been relieved. You say you go to Jeff's hotel room. Could you do that in 2021?
I'm not sure if you could, because I think the teams have so much security. I'm sure you get yelled at. I think you should try to do it. And I think the reporters today, they want so badly to maintain a good relationship with the team, the people they cover. And the best explanation to that is, if there is a murder somewhere, unfortunately, reporters will knock on the door of the victim's family. Mm-hmm. They'll knock on the door of the suspect who might have been arrested. Why can't we go knock on the door of a basketball coach for an NBA team? Like you have to still, the essence is you're a reporter. And at that moment, this young, obscure assistant coach gets the job. The Knicks did not have shoot around that night. We're reporters. We don't care. We figured out where his room was. You know what? He can just say, I'm not talking. That's his job. Our job is to ask. That's like, people say that all the time. Oh, that was a dumb question that they asked. Well, not really. If you don't ask it, you never know what they're going to say. Sometimes you just have to ask something. That's the only way you're going to get an answer. That's our job.
Mm-hmm.
So all we can do, and you have to do it, is knock on the door. If Jeff wants to answer the door, if he wants to speak to us, that's great. And that's what happened that day.
95, 96 were kind of lackluster. 97 up 3-1, and then they blow it. 98, 99 against the Heat, the brawl, Allen Houston. Do you hold any of those? And then of course it starts to get into the 2000s, which we will get into in a second. But any of those moments, teams, seasons you hold in highest regard, because that's really when the Garden was on fire.
Honestly, I think all of them in a lot of ways, because they were winning. We would be critical of the players. There might be sometimes where Charles Oakley wouldn't talk to you for a couple of weeks. Patrick would be mad, but he would talk. But the way that they interacted with us, it was very professional. And they conducted themselves like a big time team. So it was hard not to like a lot of guys on the team. And when they made the big moves to get Chris Childs, Allen Houston, then Larry Johnson, and Larry Johnson, I hit it off right away. And to be tight with Larry Johnson was huge, because he was the one guy in the team that every faction liked, whether it was, later on, whether it was like Camby and Latrell Sprewell, Patrick Ewing, a veteran, the Allen Houston, Charlie Ward kind of click. Larry was kind of he sat on like the emperor's throne. He really was the leader in a lot of ways of that team. But 97, the final night of the season, which tells you all you need to know about the NBA, the Knicks go to Chicago. Final night of the season, where if it were today, the top 10 players on both teams wouldn't play. Mm-hmm. Jordan is out there, Pippen is out there, Patrick Ewing is out there, and the Knicks win. Pippen shoots an air ball at the buzzer, and that seals the win for the Knicks. The Knicks then go on to beat Charlotte in 3 games. They then take the first game off of Miami. So if you go back to the regular season, they're on a 7-game winning streak. Going into game 2 against Miami, they lose that, but they win the next 2 at home. And we're thinking, not only are the Knicks going to win game 5, the NBA is going to start the series against Chicago, Eastern Conference Finals, on that Sunday, however the days fell. So we packed for going to Chicago for almost a week. The writers did. I was convinced that Miami had no reason to beat the Knicks. They just weren't better than them. Now, to Miami's credit, they outplayed them in game 5. And then the whole thing happened late, where Oak set the hard pick on Tim Hardaway. Morning came over after Oakley stepped over Hardaway. They start pushing and shoving. They both get ejected. Or Oak got ejected, and then the free throws, and that started the whole fight. And that team, it's a shame that team never got the chance to play the Chicago Bulls. And as much as I love the guys on that team, I wouldn't bet against Michael Jordan. If you're telling me now that year they split 2-2. If you're telling me in a 7-game series, I tend to think that Jordan would find a way. God bless him. Jeff Van Gundy, Patrick, those guys, Allen Houston, they're convinced that they would have won, which is what makes sports great. That one was tough, because I felt like that was Patrick Ewing's, in terms of him being healthy, that was his last great chance to win an NBA championship. And it got taken away by stupid things that happened in Miami in game 5.
By the way, what is it like going in the locker room after a moment like that, after like a brawl? Are you even allowed?
Yeah, that one, they'll keep the locker room closed for a longer period of time. I'm sure they're trying to get their story straight. They're probably trying to tell the players what to say, what not to say. But when you went in that locker room after game 7, and Starks was suspended for that game, as was Larry Johnson. I still say to this day, remember the way they did it?
Yeah.
Because there were so many players suspended, it went in alphabetical order.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still convinced to this day, if either game 6 or game 7, if Ewing and Starks could have played together, they would have won. I thought like that, like really messed up the team. That's because Ewing was suspended for game 6. Starks was suspended for game 7. So they never got to play together for one of those last 2 games. I thought having those 2 out there would have made a huge difference.
I grew up in a household filled with Bulls fans. All my friends loved the Bulls, etc. 90s. And I was the biggest Ewing defender. He's my favorite athlete of all time. Always had to defend him. And then sometimes stories would come out. Doesn't sign autographs on game day, doesn't shake hands with sick kids. He's grumpy with the media. He's not really a nice guy, all this stuff. What is the true story on Patrick Ewing? Was he like that? Was he actually, because, there are stories out there about some guys who are just, angels. Of course, we know no one's truly an angel, but
Yeah.
it always felt like there were the negative things that I had to defend about Patrick Ewing. Of course, not even knowing the guy, but always trying to spin it. What
Yeah.
was he like? You said the story where he said your name, but like on a day-to-day basis,
Yeah.
I remember he would wear the bathrobe. I remember those MSG shots. He's sitting there
Always.
very short with his
Me-
answers. What was he like?
Yeah. He could be a pain in the neck to deal with.
Okay.
Absolutely. Didn't talk all the time. But, if you go back and you look at Patrick's life, all right, so here's a guy from Jamaica. His mom moves to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she's going to try to make enough money to send for the rest of the family. So Patrick, his dad, the rest of his family, they move to Cambridge. He becomes a huge star. Mike Jarvis tells the story. Patrick's walking around, I think he's in the 7th or 8th grade, and Mike Jarvis says, "Son, where'd you move from?" He says, "Jamaica." He said, like a U17. He couldn't believe that Patrick was still a young kid that's going to play for the varsity. So Patrick becomes a big star in Boston. And then he just announces he had it narrowed down to Boston College and Georgetown. He picks Georgetown. Now he starts going to high school games, and people are throwing banana peels at him. They're holding up signs that say Ewing can't read, all this stuff. He goes to Georgetown his first year. And I went back and looked up this stuff. At the Big East tournament, Patrick's freshman year, the athletic director of Georgetown got up at a press conference at Madison Square Garden to confirm that Patrick was indeed matriculating at Georgetown. So people were talking, like, you think about that. You think about the way we treat athletes today. People were talking about his intelligence, whether or not he even belonged in school. This as he's an 18, 19-year-old freshman. How crazy is that? The New York Times covered his college graduation. They were there. And I still remember the line in the story where, like, Patrick refused to be interviewed. Like, come on, man. People are questioning your intelligence for about 4 or 5 years. And the day you graduate, the New York Times is there just to kind of talk about the biggest name in college basketball graduating, and he's going to be playing right for no, they wouldn't have known he was on the Knicks yet, but they covered his graduation. He doesn't want to talk to anybody. So I think for him, he didn't trust a lot of people. I'm pretty sure he didn't think that everyone had the best intentions. So I think naturally that made him a little uneasy around people, a little untrusting. I think it manifests itself by people constantly asking him to do stuff, and him sometimes saying, "You know what, I need to pull back a little bit." I'm not making an excuse for him.
No.
I just think I think that has a lot to do with it.
I have always felt, even though we only just met a few years ago, I've always felt a kinship with you because your story reminds me a little bit of my story in that the team, the organization that you are covering, you do not have the best relationship with. However, I think that has made you better at your job, and I think it's made me better at my job. My story, of course, being with the UFC, you with the New York Knicks. When do things start to turn in a negative way between you and the organization?
Yeah. It's funny, right, when you say that, because when you do like the people that you're covering, you have good relationships with them. I remember after the lockout, when Patrick Ewing was heavily involved in the 99 lockout, and the Knicks played an exhibition game. When the lockout got settled, Latrell Sprewell is on the Knicks. His first exhibition game is against New Jersey at Madison Square Garden. They only played 2 exhibition games. They played the Nets in both. And the game is played, and Patrick is horrible. And I remember writing in my story about how Patrick was all thumbs and love handles because he looked like he had put on weight. And when he saw me in New Jersey a couple of nights later and he brought that up to me, I felt bad. I was like, man, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Like, you always question, oh man, that's kind of, maybe I was a little too hard on him, even though I meant it kind of as a joke. But there is something to be said when you have a good relationship with the team you cover. So back then we were judging them on being a championship team. And if they fell short, the tone of the coverage was like, you know what? Yeah, the Knicks are good, but they're still not good enough. And they kind of accepted it because they wanted to win a championship. Jeff Van Gundy leaves. You have these lean years where the team is dysfunctional. They're losing games. And I'm just covering what's going on. I'm not dictating the results. I'm not dictating the dysfunction. I'm just covering it. And then became this idea where they would get upset at the negative tone of the coverage. I mean, what does a negative tone mean? You're winning 20 games. My job isn't I don't work for the Knicks. My job isn't to spin things the way you want it done. And then when the owner came in, he did not like seeing his name in the paper. He did not like seeing his name in the paper if you were being critical of him. And then really, Mike Lupica is working at the Daily News, and he had done a bunch of critical stories about him. So it was all kind of coming down on me, where they were, they didn't want players talking to me. They would give emails. They would send emails out to every writer, practice at 12 tomorrow, be there by 11:30. They wouldn't send me those emails. I mean, how petty is that?
Yeah.
Hey, come on.
Did
But
they
you know
ever
what,
ban
though?
you?
They tried to. They would try to take credentials away. The best was the time when, so after every season it'd be dysfunctional, and they would try to kind of repair their relationship with me, which wasn't like, we didn't need to have a good relationship, just be professional. I'll cover the team. I mean, if you guys win 50 games like they did in the year with Carmelo and Mike Woodson, it's going to be covered like it's a good year. So they would be really nice to me, like right before the season started, as if like, let's get the season off to a good start. Well, all right, I'm still going to cover what happened. So I found out that Jim Dolan had tried to drive into the Garden, and a security guard stopped him. And he told him, I'm Jim Dolan. He said, no, but I was told everyone has to show their ID. And Jim Dolan didn't have his ID. So there was this big blow up. Somebody who was there told me about it. And I wrote about it, and they completely freaked out. So the first game of the season, I walk in the locker room, and two Garden security guys who I know they work for the Garden, they're almost like henchmen. I could see them standing in the locker room, and you've never seen them in the locker room. And I could see the guy kind of nudging the one guy, like going like that. That's him over there. That's him over there. So I did like this weird experiment. I was like, I think these guys are like looking at me, or maybe even following me. I walked out of the locker room, and they followed me out.
Wow.
I walked back in, they came in. So then I walked upstairs to go to where, the media room is on the 6th floor of the Garden. I walk up the steps, and Andy Miller, the agent, is standing there, and it's an agent of players. So I stop and I'm talking, and I'm saying to Andy, I said, you see these two guys right here? These guys are following me. He's like, no, they're not. Like, what are you, you're so paranoid. The stuff that you probably go through as well. I said, no, I'm not. So I walked away, and I turned to both of them, and I felt like the character in Goodfellas, the Robert De Niro character. I looked at both of them. I said, hey, if you guys want, I'm going to get something to eat first, and then I'm going to come back out here in about 10 minutes. And one of the guys started laughing because the poor guy was probably thinking, how absurd is this? We have to follow this knucklehead around. And they did such a great job covering it. Within 5 minutes, I knew what they were trying to do. I said, I'm going to go inside for like 10 minutes. I'm going to come back out.
At any point, does this get elevated to the Basketball Writers Association to where you can't do your job properly? Or if they're trying to ban you, I would imagine.
It kind of did, but it never, like, when it's funny, people talk about harassment, bullying, and all this stuff. Well, what do you think was happening to me? I was getting absolutely destroyed. Ultimately, no one cared. Even the league would tell me, yeah, Frank, we know what's going on, but you're dealing with a billionaire owner and then just some guy that covers the team for the Daily News. So, what, in some ways it was fine. It was stressful at times to go to work when you knew, like, all the time they were trying to make it hard for you. You knew anytime they got a new player, they would tell the player, this guy's awful, don't talk to him. And it would take a long time to build up trust. I still remember being it might've been Tyson Chandler's second year, and he called me over. We were on the court in Milwaukee. And he was like, hey man, he goes, I know what like goes on around here. And like, you've been really cool to me. I just want you to know, I have no problem with you. I said, listen, man, I said, don't, you don't have to worry about me. I said, things get crazy here. I'm able to do my job. And really what it comes down to as well, their big thing was, we got to cut off his sources, right? Mm-hmm. That was what they were trying to do. But it's a lot of times it's a friend of a player, a family member of a player, the agent. There's always people talking. What'll happen as well is a player on the Knicks may tell a player on another team something that happened. I have a relationship with that agent. They tell me, I do a little digging, and sure enough, the story turns out to be true. They were so obsessed. I always used to say it all the time. They were more obsessed with the media than they were with winning. Mm. And it's almost like they never got it because it's run by a corporation where everything is about spinning. Sports, there's nothing to spin. Every game, they keep score. And if you have a better score than the other team, you get the win. And all those wins over time and all those losses, they measure up, and then you have the standings and you have playoffs. That's what determines it. It's not the coverage of the team. That's why I left. There was some, I'm not going to name names, but you watch some of the media in some of these markets, their teams are terrible, but you can tell they're getting all their stuff from the team. Now we got this guy next year is going to be better, and this guy's growing, this guy's developing. And then every year you look, it's the same crap with them. Just cover the team.
So you were off the beat in 2017, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So at any point, I mean, that's a long stretch, 95 to 2017. At any point you say, to the bosses, like, this just isn't fun. I mean, who wants to go to work every day where you're being treated like this? Did you ever consider leaving because it just got to be too much?
It was weird. In my own way, I was stubborn. I kind of felt like I didn't want them to think that they beat me down.
Yeah.
In some ways, but I also think in the long run, I probably made a mistake. I probably should have gotten off the beat a couple of years early, just for my own, sanity. I should have done it. But then Phil Jackson came on, and there was like a certain arrogance to him, and the whole thing where, just because he won with the Bulls, and I always used to say he's going to sprinkle magic triangle dust on the team, and they're going to be good. And I always felt like, and listen, I have unbelievable respect for Phil Jackson as a coach. I mean, come on, man, he won all those titles. There is something to be said for coaching great players and winning with them. There is a talent in that too. But I just didn't feel like a rookie GM who'd never done this before and is not really going to work that hard is going to be able to turn around the Knicks. And I was also a little turned off by his press conference because the Knicks had to give him a ton of money to convince him to come out of retirement, which is also, that's never going to work. And his whole press conference was about my relationship and my link to the Knicks and Red Holtzman and Walt Frazier and the Garden and Willis Street. I'm thinking, yeah, but it still took you about $15 million a year for you to come work for them. So it really wasn't the nostalgia. It was really the money that did it. And then he got up there and he said, I'm going to change the way things are done here. And I need the media's help. And, things are going to change. And at the press conference, there were, I think, 4 Daily News reporters there. Myself, Philip Bondi, a couple other guys. We had our hands raised. Never once did we get called on.
Wow.
So right then and there, I said, nothing's going to change. And sure enough, nothing changed.
What is your relationship like with the Knicks now?
Well, I mean, I've known Leon Rose for 20 years.
Yeah.
I know
Tom.
I know Worldwide West. I've known Tom for 25 years. I'm good with those guys. I hope they do well.
What about the PR?
No, I haven't really dealt with them in a long time. The PR director that was there, who's no longer there, I probably didn't talk to him for 7 years.
That's Jonathan, right? Jonathan.
Yeah, I didn't say one word to him. There was no reason to, which was fine. His job was to try to destroy me. So what am I going to do? Say hello to him every day?
Right.
Ask him for his help. Tell him, hey, I'm working on a story. Let me give you a heads up on what it is.
Yeah.
There was no reason to.
So at this juncture, because there's all these guys, I mean, a familiar face, Tom Thibodeau returning after being an assistant coach in the 90s. And I know he was accused of being one of your quote unquote sources.
Which by the way,
yeah.
I know you can't reveal your sources.
No.
You can get my phone records, which I'm sure the Knicks have. And I would give you all my emails. Tom doesn't say anything. Tom's one of these guys. What do you got? What are you hearing? What are you hearing? What are you hearing? And then if you ask Tom, when Tom was getting the job, I'll tell you something. So Tom is the head coach, assistant coach in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
It's the NBA Finals, and I think he's already taken. It might have been the year before. He doesn't have the job yet in Chicago. That comes the next year. So I tell my boy Dave Waldstein from the New York Times, we're up there covering. It's going to be the day before Game 1. I said, Dave, ask Kobe Bryant about Tom, what he knows about him, because I knew the story. But Dave was like, why? Because Dave was looking for a story to do on Kobe. I said, ask him that. He'll give you a story. So he asked Kobe Bryant about Tom, and Kobe starts to, he's the guy that taught me this move. He starts going on and on, because when I was a high school kid, I'd go to the Sixer practices and Tom would stay around and he'd work with me on my game all the time. He'd let me practice with the team. So Tom's relationship with Kobe had gone back years, and Kobe's even joking around. He knows all my moves. So it'll be interesting. He'll be able to tell everyone on the Celtics my tendencies and everything like that. So Dave ended up getting a good story out of it. But my thing was like, I knew that this story will help Tom. It'll increase his profile. So if anybody was like kind of operating behind the scenes, it was probably me a little bit, but Tom never, that's not the way he operates. He comes from the Pat Riley kind of Jeff Van Gundy school. Like that's like really tight knit. Those guys, they're all about like working. They have good relationships with the media. They're willing to talk to you. But Tom, if anybody thinks that Tom is going to talk to me and say, can you believe that Don Chaney's doing this? Or can you, there's no chance. You don't know who he is if you think that. And you know what? You're trying to make excuses for maybe you failing at your job, because that's nonsense. It really is.
So you could go to a Knick game now. You could cover a Knick game now.
I guess I haven't tried to yet. I guess I could.
I mean, if you have a good relationship with Leon, with Worldwide West, with Tom, I talked
to Tom after they beat Chicago, and Brian Scalabrine had said he was in the restaurant after the game, and Tom was there with all the players. So I said, I'm going to bust his balls on this one. So I hadn't spoken to him for about probably 2 weeks. And I called him up and he answered the phone in New Orleans. I said, let me tell you something right now. Pat Riley, after an October win, is not popping champagne celebrating. Just remember that.
In your opinion, what is the difference now with this team? Because it seems like, perhaps, you tell me if I'm wrong, Jim Dolan is less hands-on and things are going well. The culture is better. People want to play for the Knicks.
100%.
What changed?
I think they're letting Tom coach the team, and B, I think it also helps because you need stars to win in the NBA. The Knicks are going to have to get one. I think they know that. But without like any really true stars on the team, even though Randall was an all-star, I voted him, I think, 5th in the MVP. I think they have a group of guys that all want to get better, that play for one another, that kind of play the way the 90s Knicks did, but without the superstar player like they had in Patrick Ewing. And here's the thing about Tom, and you've heard Brian talk about it as well. Tom is detail oriented. He doesn't run the players into the ground in practice. He's going to help you get better. Listen to what Derrick Rose says about it. Players want to get better because if you get better, you win and you get paid. That's what the players all want. So players around Tom, really, who are the guys that like playing for Tom? Derrick Rose, Larry Johnson loved him. Jimmy Butler loved him. It's always the same kind of guy. It's the hard playing guy who wants to get after it. And those are the guys that are usually successful. Look at the lunatics up in Boston. Kevin Garnett, Kendrick Perkins, Rondo, Paul Pierce, Ray Allen. What do they all have in common? They're all like relentless, tireless workers. That's how you win in the NBA. And that's what Tom has out of this group. I still think the talent is a little bit short, but that kind of team resonates with the New York fans. They love the fact that they go out there and fight. Remember how many comeback wins they had last year? Now, this year, they keep blowing leads late in games, but it's a team that people identify with, and there is a link there. There is a bit of a Pat Riley to Jeff Van Gundy, now to Tom Thibodeau. They're all connected. And when you hear Tom talk about Pat Riley, Tom talks about 3 coaches a certain way: Pat Riley, Bill Belichick, and his buddy Tony La Russa, who he got to know when he was coaching in Chicago. Those guys all have like a little something in common, just the way that their teams play and the culture that they create around the organization.
In your opinion, can the Knicks win a championship with Jim Dolan as owner of the team?
If he stays in the background, he can't be impulsive like he is. He can't be at a Knicks Cleveland game 2 seasons ago, and I believe the game was in November, and the Knicks are getting blown out in the game. And I got a text from someone who was with him that night, and they said, Jim's going crazy right now at halftime. If they lose this game, he's going to make the GM, he's going to make Steve and Scott Perry apologize. And I was like, no chance that's happening. Sure enough, they lost the game, and Steve Mills and Scott Perry got in front of the media. You see how nervous they looked?
Yeah.
And like, you can't, you tear apart the fabric of the team. When the players know that the coach really isn't in charge, it's never going to work. You just can't be that way. And you can't be the kind of guy that, let's get rid of this guy. I don't want this guy around anymore. It doesn't work like that. They have the right coach here, but who knows? Like, I don't know if things will change. Like a loss like last night, is he sitting there thinking we were supposed to win this game? What is this guy doing? He's probably working them too hard. I have no idea. But thus far, Jim Dolan's been really good. It looks like he stayed out of it. Like a lot of the good. If you're an owner, it's your team, and you have a right to be involved to a certain level. But hire the right people and let them run it. That's why Mickey Harrison. Think about what they have in Miami. It's Pat Riley, the rest of the front office, Eric Spoelstra. It works like that. Those are the organizations where it works.
I know you have a million jobs. Just a few more questions, if I can. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the time. I appreciate it. I consider you sort of like the dawn of NBA journalism. I mean, you've been doing this for so long. What is your take?
You're only saying that because I'm here, but go ahead.
Absolutely. I'd say this to Woj as well. What is your take on NBA journalism in 2021? Because you know what I'm getting at, right? I mean, like there's journalism, and then there's just like, the scoops. I got to be honest, from afar, there's not a lot of sourcing. There's not a lot of crediting, which I don't like.
Yeah.
I find that to be a strange thing. But in your opinion, like, what's your take on the relationship between the media, the players, and just the state of NBA journalism in 2021?
I think the NBA does a much better job kind of controlling the press a little bit, and especially now, COVID and post-COVID, where everything now is done on they bring the guys up to a podium. And so now you can't work the locker room before a game, after a game. Perfect example, Boston gets that ugly loss to the Chicago Bulls. Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown don't even meet with the media, which tells you all you need to know. But I do think a lot of the young writers, I think what they've seen is a lot of them love the analytic part of the game. I think a lot of them, when we came into the business, I think a lot of us aspired to one day become a columnist. And then all of a sudden this TV stuff started. But I don't think a lot of us, when we started out, because we probably weren't smart enough to think we should be trying to get into TV, but you would think, I'm going to go from being a beat writer to a columnist. I think a lot of the young guys come in, and there's nothing wrong with it, but I think a lot of them think, I want to go from being a basketball reporter to working in the front office. So I think when you go in with that mindset, you're not as critical of the teams you cover, the GM, the coaches, and then your stories are more about like the trends and, the corner 3-pointer and all that stuff. That's their way of covering. I don't necessarily agree with it. I think the coverage is way too soft. I thought the coverage last year on Kyrie Irving, when he missed 2 weeks, was incredibly soft. I mean, the guy blew off his team for 2 weeks. I mean, I'm on the Yes Network, which does the games, and I wasn't going overboard, but I was being critical of the guy. You can't just ghost your team for 2 weeks. So it's little things like that where I think, because everyone wants to be a lot more sensitive to the players, which I totally get. But when stuff is being done where they need to be criticized, there's nothing wrong with critical analysis. Just because you criticize a player today doesn't mean tomorrow you have to criticize him, even if he didn't do anything wrong. I always talk about, I love watching the guy, and Roy Keane, who used to play for Manchester United. He's on the BBC, former player. And this guy is a legend. You should hear him talk about the players. It's just the way Charles Barkley does. They're just giving their honest assessment in this moment. And, listening to our radio show, we went after LeBron a lot, but I would say we praise LeBron probably 95% of the time. But when the 5% where he deserves to be criticized, they're not going to give him a pass. That's the part I don't understand. I think the writers today, they just don't want to go down that road because the players can respond automatically on social media, which has something to do with it. I think if the criticism is fair, you have to be critical every once in a while. If somebody's not mad at you, my boy Joe Sexton, who used to work at the New York Times, first thing he told me when I covered the Mets, and he's now at the ProPublica, and he's they won 1 million awards, Pulitzer Prize, the whole thing. He said, if somebody's not mad at you, you're not doing a good job. I think that's true.
You mentioned the book with Oakley comes out February of 2022. I can't wait. I think the darkest day in Knicks history wasn't when they didn't get, KD or losing this game. The darkest day is when they dragged him out like a piece of trash in front of the crowd. And I mean, this guy's number should be in the rafters, let alone, dragging him out. What was that experience like, writing the book with him? And are there things in the book that we don't know about those? And please, I don't want you to give away anything, but like the shots at Ewing over the last few years have been hard to take.
I agree. Oh, I agree with that. I think that part of it, that's the way he feels.
Yeah.
I don't feel that way. Like I tried to tell him this, and this isn't coming from Patrick, it's coming from me, but I said, Patrick Ewing is coaching Georgetown. And the Big East has a relationship with Madison Square Garden. I think the fact that Patrick's not coming out and destroying Madison Square Garden, I get that. But he also works for a university that plays in the Big East. So I think I think Charles sometimes doesn't see the big picture when it comes to stuff like that. But I do know this. He goes to Chicago and he gets a nice ovation. He goes to Toronto, as you know. The people up there love him. And I think part of him will never admit it because he's just too much of a tough guy. But how can that not bother him? This guy, I still found it so symbolic that a guy who was known for giving everything he had, diving on the floor for loose balls. I got kicked in the head once by him jumping over the scores table to get a loose ball. And where did we last see him at Madison Square Garden? On the floor and getting dragged out. I thought it was horrible. And there's no way that he went there that night knowing that he had a ticket right behind Jim Dolan. And there's no way that he's going to start a fight with Jim. The whole thing started really even before the game began. So I don't get the whole thing. That it never should have come to that. And for him to be such a great player and means so much to the city, and the way the whole thing was handled, it was really despicable. And think about what's gone on in this country the last year and a half. That happened before that. You think that would have happened today?
Mm-mm.
They would take the team away from the owner of the team if they did that to Charles Oakley, dragging him out in handcuffs. It was horrible.
Do you think they fix it? Do you think he gets welcome back?
He, I think they want to.
Oh,
I think he's been really hurt by the whole thing. I know it created some issues for his mom, who got really sick, and because of all the stress that she was under. I think that part of it is going to be really hard for him to come back from, because I think the league wants it to end. I do think that Jim Dolan maybe at this point wants it to end. I just think that he feels the way the whole thing was handled, number one. Then Jim Dolan went on the radio station and talked about Charles having a drinking problem. And you would think that Jim Dolan would be a little bit more sympathetic to, even though Charles is saying that's nonsense. Jim Dolan has been a guy, and to his credit, has dealt with his own issues off the court. And, that I think that part of it really, really bothers him.
last thing for you, and again, thank you for the time. From everything from the Mets to the work with the Knicks, breaking through on television, PTI. I mean, that's a small club that gets to go on PTI. That's a very prestigious club, and it's a tremendous show. It's a legendary show. What are you most proud of? When you think about, this is my crown jewel achievement, what is that?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned all of it. I mean, certainly getting the call from PTI was pretty cool, and the people at ESPN have been great to me. The guys around the horn. It's still probably writing for a newspaper. There is something about that, because I grew up. I delivered the Daily News.
Wow.
As a kid, and there'd be the big fight. Ollie's fighting somebody, and of course, we're not getting direct TV in our house, and you're just waking up in the morning. You look at the back page, and you wanted to see what Mike Lupica, Dick Young, some of these great columnists were writing. So there was something really cool about doing that. So from a professional standpoint, that personal standpoint, obviously my kids, which I still say to this day, and you'll see this as you get older. It's so cool. Like, I got to see Usain Bolt. I say this all the time. I got to see Usain Bolt win the 100 meters in London. It's incredible. I got to see Michael Jordan hit that last shot against the Utah Jazz. So, I've seen some incredible, incredible things. But for me, still watching my own kids play, I still would take that. There's just something more exciting about it. And at its most basic level, it's just sports and having fun. But, that to me is the most fun I've had.
You give me chills when you say that, because in my world, Saturday is the most important day, right? That's when the fights are. And I have noticed in the past year, you tell me about any massive fight on a Saturday in Vegas, at the Garden, anywhere. Do you want to be there, or do you want to be at the park watching your 8-year-old playing soccer? Any day, like, without question, the joy that I get out of watching that, and the pain that I get for having to miss that is immense. Yeah. And so I know exactly what you're saying.
And Ariel too, because there's always going to be, because when your kids get to be 20, 25, there's still going to be other fights. Like that part of it is never going to go away.
That's true.
This part of it does go away. That's why that's what makes it more special.
Well, what a way to wrap this up, from the kid who walked to the corner store to buy the paper to read you. Now we're talking about kids and your great achievements of writing in the paper. This has been a huge honor for me. Thank you so much, Frank. Continued success. I hope you get to cover the league for many, many more years. Starting lineup on SiriusXM, NBA radio. The Nets on Yes, pre and post game. I'm so flustered. I'm so, starstruck by your presence. And, of course, the stuff that you're doing on ESPN is great. Every time you pop up, dare I say, I don't want to get you in trouble. I think they should use you more, if I'm being honest, on ESPN. But that's a different discussion for a different day. Well, thank you for doing this.
And I appreciate everything you've said. Say hello to your family for me. I'm happy for all your success. Like I said, I came up to you. On the street, running up like right. I said, I think that's Drake. Oh no, it's the guy from the I Hate Christian Laettner documentary. By the way, do you hate Christian Laettner? Or you like him?
I grew up hating him, but now, I mean, he seems like a pretty nice guy. Just grew up hating that team, the '90s Duke team. But now he seems cool.
When I was in London for the Olympics, the tube stopped, door opens, who gets on? Christian Laettner.
Wow, look at you name dropping. One of the all-time great name droppers you are, is what
I've learned
from your radio show. I mean, it's just constant, but I like it.
Hang on, it wasn't better than the elevator stopping in New Orleans. Oh my God, I'm going to forget her name now. The girl that used to date Amber Rose. What's her name?
That's better. I mean, Leitner
Oh.
walking into the tube is better than Amber. Come on.
How about Gabby Union in San Antonio when the elevator door opens?
Not bad. Not bad. Not bad.
That's gonna be my next book, when the elevator door opens.
Thanks for doing this, Frank. All the best.
Thanks, Ariel.